and the exaltation of orality from Kornaros to Kazantzakis. Βάρδα από γράμματα is perhaps not the most auspicious note on which to begin a conference about modern Greek letters. I can only surmise that the organizers want us to cast a fearless Cretan glance into the abyss right from the start. My topic was in fact conceived as an overdue homage to David Holton. I was one of his first students in modern Greek in circumstances which are detailed in my abstract. Way back in 1970, one of the memorable pearls that David cast before us Oxford undergraduates was the delectable paradox that modern Greek literature comes out of the cradle intoning anatheman ta gramματα, courtesy of Φτωχοπρόδρομος. What a marvellously subversive overture to a national literature. Letters biting the very pen that feeds them. And Φτωχοπρόδρομος wasn't cussing alone. Michail Glikas, another malcontent in the Komnenian court, was advising honest folk to strangle their sons rather than have them learn letters. David must have guessed that the cathartic mantra anathema ta gramματα could assuage the spirits of a mutinous class of undergraduates preparing for their final examinations. And as I have revised for the various papers on periods of Greek literature, my eye was irresistibly drawn to many later variations on the prodromic imprecation. In various guises, it pervaded all the literary genre, right through into the 20th century, where in poetry, I varia skia tu palama fell over the Oxford prescriptions, thanks to our regular tutor, Dr. Robin Fletcher. I duly enjoyed the papyrus burning in O Δωδεκάλογος του Γύφτου, and among Palamas's shorter poems, I appreciated O πιο τρανός καημός μου, where the poet mightily regrets having invested his life in books instead of nature. Δε χάρηκα σκυφτός μες στα βιβλία, ο φύση, ολάκερη ζωή και ολάκερη σοφία. As for the prose fiction on the Oxford course, it included a resounding trashing of letters and literati in Kazantzakis' novel Βίος και Πολιτεία του Alexis Orba, of which much more presently. But even in the discursive prose, there was Seferis thanking God that Makrianis had escaped a formal education in letters. And in the prescribed theatre, men of letters were roundly ridiculed, starting with the Cretan Renaissance caricatures of Odaskalus, with his macaronic mixture of Latin, Venetian and Cretan dialect, and his sexual idiosyncrasies. And then there were folk songs suggesting that those overburdened with letters are deficient in other vital departments. From Ipyros, the song Tis kakopαντρεμένης με γραμματικό, where the scribe's wife complains, «Μαράζιας η καρδούλα μου από τους γραμματισμένους, που περβατούν και μουρμουρούν και σιγουριά δεν έχουν. Τη νύχτα πιάνουν το χαρτί, τα χιά πιάνουν την πένα. Δεν θέλω εγώ γραμματικό, κι ούτε γραμματισμένο. Θέλω κλεφτοπαλίκαρο, κι ας είναι λερωμένο». All this aversion therapy may have subconsciously influenced my choice of topic for postgraduate research, deflecting me from the usual literary and philological areas into the bosom of Marcos Vamvakaris, who had famously sung in the 1930s, «Μη με βαράς κύριε δάσκαλε και μη μου κάνεις κόλπα. Και δεν μαθαίνω γράμματα, χίλιες φορές σου το είπα». My doctoral thesis was on rebetika, their poetics and performance. One of the main sources of my field work was Michalis Genitsaris, who described his compositions as αγράμματα τραγούδια. When Genitsaris said έγραψα τραγούδι, he usually meant recording it for the gramophone, and his signature composition proclaims «Αντί σχολείο μου πάγαινα, μες του Καραϊσκάκη, έπινα διάφορα πιωτά να μάθω μπουζουκάκι». Lest we stray too far from Crete, I should mention that this theme of heroic truancy and the pursuit of alternative forms of education also occurs in Cretan rebetika, as in these Lakoudianes Mandinades collected by Yannis Zaimakis of the University of Crete and kindly supplied for me to use today. Εγώ δεν πήγα στο σχολείο για αντάμουνα μορτάκι και μ' άρεσε να τριγυρνώ στις Όλγα στο κονάκι. Γράμματα δεν εγείρε αυγά, δεν τα ήθελε η ψυχή μου. Γιάντα ζωή καλή γλεντό μαζί με τη μικρή μου. Back in 1970, David Holton offered us a second seminal observation, another paradox. The literary denigration of letters and literati sometimes has as its corollary the exaltation of oral performance and tradition. The Eratokritos supplies some memorable examples, perhaps most conspicuously in Aretousa's defection from the literate camp to that of orality. Right from book 1, she avers, «Το γράμμαν έχω οχτρό μου και τη φωνή γιατρό μου». And again in book 2, the written word comes spectacularly to grief in the joust of Rotokritos and Kypridimos, where ουδέ γράμμα του επόμενε στην κεφαλή και το μεγάλο πράμα να τα ξεσκίσει κονταρά και όλα να σκορπιστούσει και από τη φωτιά του κονταρού καμένα να τα βρούσει. So much for scripta manent. In contrast, the oral word is invincible. Κάθε καρδιά ανελάμπανε, ανήτως σαν το χιόνι, σ' αίτια γλυκότατη φωνή, κοντά της να σημώνει. Εμέρων όλα τα άγρια, τα δυνατά παλένα. From the outset of the Eratokritos, orality and writing seem to be set in dialectical competition, alongside other binary opposites, and writing seems to come off second best. Turning now to our other Cretan bookend, Kazantzakis repeatedly thematizes and anathematizes τα γράμματα in his novels. In Zorbas, the narrator presents his devotion to letters as a form of drug addiction. Χασισοπότικα στοχάζουμε και ενεργώ με χαρτί και καλαμάρι. This is in stark contrast to the programmatically named hero Alexis Zorbas, with his irrepressible urge to decisive action and spontaneous communication, whether through oral narrative, music, or dance. The narrator belittles himself as a pathetic paper mouse. He would rather read a book about love than make it, whereas Zorbas' prolific loins keep replicating his DNA until the eve of his death. In words recalling Xeferison Makrigiannis, the paper mouse says of Zorbas, «Ο άνθρωπος αυτός συλλογίστηκα, δεν πήγε στο σχολείο και το μυαλό του δεν χάλασε». A paper mouse can't begin to do him justice. Ο Zorbas κατάντησε στα χέρια μου μελάνι και χαρτί, τζουτζές κάποιου καλαμαρά. Kapitan Michalis begins with the protagonist destroying a letter, and throughout the novel he has a problem with paper. When he's not shredding it or burning it, he's tearing up valuable old books to make cartridges. Ποτέ του δεν άνοιξε βιβλίο να διαβάσει. Συχαίνονταν τα γράμματα, συχαίνονταν τους γραμματισμένους. Και όταν ξέσπαζε επανάσταση, ξέσκιζε με αγαλίαση τα παλιά κοιτάπια των μοναστηριών και τα έκανε φυσέκια. Έβλεπε τον Τίτηρο, τον αδερφό του, και κουνούσε με καταφρόνια την κεφάλα του. Να που καταντούν τα γράμματα των άνθρωπων. Γυαλάκια, παντελονάκια, καμπουρίτσα. Βάρδα από γράμματα θρασάκι. Χτυκιώνε, μη κολλήσεις. Michalis' visceral abomination of letters is complemented by his extreme economy of speech. His heroic code favors swift, laconic repartee in the Cretan vernacular, and he rings around his blood brother Nuribe in this macho verbal art. He also has a repertoire of bestial grunting and inarticulate noises. Egrukse was usually how he addressed men, and for his women folk, a cough outside the door would suffice to clear the room and cause his baby daughter to be drugged up lest she cry and annoy him. The Taliban would have been proud of him. In Anaphora στο Greco, Kazantzakis attaches many of the attributes of Kapitan Michalis to his own censorious father, starting with an utterly utilitarian attitude to letters. Να μάθεις γράμματα για να βοηθήσεις την Κρήτη να ελευθερωθεί. Αυτός είναι ο σκοπός. Αλλιώς στο διάλογο τα πάντα γράμματα. Μήτε δάσκαλος θέλω να γίνεις, μήτε καλόγερος, μήτε σοφός Σολομώντας. Again, είχε ακουστά πως γράφω, λέει, βιβλία. Τι βιβλία, με ρώτησε την τελευταία φορά που τον είδα. Παραμύθια, ραβασάκια, μανέδες. Δεν τρέπεσαι. Μόνο οι μουνούχοι και καλόγεροι γράφουν. Άντρας είσαι, κάνε αντρίκια δουλειά. Similarly, in Χριστός ξανασταυρώνεται, γεροπατριαρχίας, μάλλον με το γιο του, που το έχει ρίξει στο διάβασμα σαν να ήταν γέρος οι παρακεντές. Ντροπιάζεις Μιχαηλή τη γενιά μας. The main man of letters in that novel is Chatzinikolis the teacher. His end is brutally symbolic. Trying to make peace between the warring villagers, he's trampled to death by both sides. Posthumously, he provides the pretext for the false accusation and murder of the Christ figure in the novel. Kazantzakis never passes over an opportunity to rubbish a teacher. Their standard epithets are ψαλιδόκολος, μπουμπονοκέφαλος με γυαλάκια, ξεφυσίδι, a disgrace to any heroic lineage. Titiros the teacher is initially even more grotesque than the local lepers. At least the lepers get into the swing of spring when the sap rises. But exceptionally, Titiros comes good. He commits murder. He activates his dormant loins. He burns his Frankish trousers and starts dressing σαν άνθρωπος. The Cretan acceptation of anthropos is truly intriguing. It was ostensibly in the name of anthropia that generations of Cretan children were subjected to the rigors of learning gramματα. We might applaud this equation of literacy with humanity, except that μαθαίνω γράμματα seems to have been a euphemism for subjection to a regime of strict corporal punishment. The literary template for the Cretan teacher was established by Kondylakis' novel Ο Πατούχας. Ο καλόγυρος έδιδε περισσότερους ραβδισμούς παρά μαθήματα, and he specialized in the bastinado, which he administered in multiples of that most biblical of measures, παραμίαν τεσσαράκοντα. The boy Patouchas was handed over to this sadist with a traditional injunction, να τον κάμεις άνθρωπον, μόνο τα κόκαλα γερά δάσκαλε, with the result that Patouchas fled to the hills and became a savage. So much for the humanizing effect of letters. Variants on that scene and the parental exhortation to the teacher recur in Kondylakis' story, όταν ήμουν δάσκαλος, and in Kazantzakis several iterations of the refrain, το κρέας δικό σου δάσκαλε, τα κόκαλα δικά μου, δέρνε τον να γίνει άνθρωπος. It seems that even well-bred Greek schoolboys must be seen to be thrashed and scolded in the name of gramata, even at Christmas. Witness this seasonal folk song from Kefalonia. Κυρά με τους πολλούς ιούς, τους καλαναθρεμένους, τσου χτένιζες, τσου στόλιζες και στο σχολείο τσου στέλνεις. Εκεί τσου δέρνει ο δάσκαλος, εκεί τσου μαγκλαβίζει. Μωρές, το πουν τα γράμματα, μωρές, το πουν ο νους σας. Τα γράμματα είναι στο χαρτί και ο νους μας στις κοπέλες. Boys shall be boys and teachers shall flay them into human beings in the name of grammata. And amazingly, Kazantzakis approves of this barbarism. In αναφορά στο Γκρέκο, he avers «Βλογώ την Άγια Βίτσα του δασκάλου». Αυτή με έμαθε πως ο πόνος είναι ο πιο μεγάλος οδηγός στον ανήφορο που φέρνει από το ζώο στον άνθρωπο. Kazantzakis was a hard act to follow, and after him, grammatophobia seems to tail off in Greek literature. My most recent literary example occurs in Skilopoliorkia, a short story by the Thessalonian Yorgos Ioannou. Its narrator is a school inspector with a literary bent, and his anathema is launched from, of all places, an alfresco lavatory in a Greek mountain village, where he spends a cold night besieged by fierce dogs. Accursed letters were to blame for his detention in that insalubrious location, which becomes a metaphor for his whole miserable life of writing. That's the last conspicuous example of a literary anathemata grammata in my collection. Whatever it was in the zeitgeist that triggered the epidemic of self-denigration among Greek writers, it seems to have dissipated with the metapolitevsi and the ensuing reforms in language and education. Coincidence or what? But as often the case, the diaspora kept on kicking the can long after the metropolis had moved on, and the prize for the non-literary anathema in my collection goes to this letter to the editor of Neos Kosmos, headlined Zito ya Grammati. As late as 1997, Diogenes the Cynic seems to have been alive and kicking in Sydney, whence he rails against all men of letters, politicians, lawyers, philosophers, orators, writers, journalists, holding them responsible for every evil afflicting humanity. Yet perhaps it's not just our Antipodean cousins that are still suffering from grammatophobia. Just think of all the negative connotations of gramata and grafo in current linguistic usage. Expressions like máthe γέρο γράμματα and τον γράφω. Babiniotis lexicon quotes «Εγώ του μιλώ και αυτός με γράφει». Again, «στο καλό και να μας γράψεις», meaning good riddance. Grafo also connotes the sinister hand of fate, της μοίρας γραφτό, and the state. Με γράψαν means I've been booked, usually for parking or speeding. But let's not over-egg the pudding here. There are countervailing dangers. Greece may be a phonocentric society, but the alphabetically challenged do not prosper. Witness the expression, την έπαθες αναγράμματος. And what about, θα πας αδιάβαστος κακομοίρη μου. Adyavastos meaning unread over, denied the extreme unction, the ultimate in short change. Vardha apo agrammatosini then, too. In literature as well, where there is discourse, there shall be counter-discourse. Enter again our hero David Holton, with his third seminal observation, to wit, in the Eratokritos, it takes both the written and the spoken word to secure the happy ending, neither being sufficient on its own, and both needing to be supplemented με γνώση και με τρόπο, good sense and savoir-faire. In later Cretan literature, we find a sophisticated apology for letters and literati in Pandelis Prevelakis Chronicomias Politias, a tribute to Rethymnon and its urbane inhabitants. Διαβασμένοι και καλότροποι, they are an education to all Crete. Indeed, Prevelakis represents his somewhat decrepit town as an open book. Ο ξεπεσμός της αρχοντικής πολιτείας διαβάζεται όπως σε βιβλίο ανοιχτό. Old Rethymnon might never qualify as one of Mr. Samaras's success stories in the vulgar world of modern commerce. But Prevelakis holds up the unbusinesslike civility of the failed merchants of Rethymnon as best practice. Του αξίζει να διαβάζετε στα σχολεία για να μαθαίνουν τα παιδιά ντροπαλοσύνη και ευγένεια. Let the Troika take note. Prevelakis' chronicler issues the token disclaimer that it was bad luck that made him a writer, but he clearly values fine writing and verbal finesse. Significantly, in surveying the civilized men of letters produced by Rethymnon and seeking to understand their singular obsession with ta gramata, Prevelakis has recourse to the explanatory power of oral tradition, invoking the Mandinada, «Ένα κλονί βασιλικό επέρασα στα αυτή μου και γύρισε και σκέπασε όλη την κεφαλή μου». He extols the verbal art of Rethymnon at length, including the Turkish storytellers, Naklidzides, all exquisite artisans of paramythosini. Indeed, Prevelakis' chronicler adopts the formulae of unpremeditated oral narrative, and he morphs into a paramythas himself, while Rethymnon evolves from an open book into paramythenia politia. Such intertwining of orality and literacy is a recurrent feature of Prevelakis' chronicle. It reminds us of Kornaros, but also of Kazantzakis, who foregrounded the traditional verbal arts both in his Odyssey and the novels. In Kapitan Michalis, the folk poet Kapitan Rimadoros is a master of comforting lies. But it would be wrong to equate the valorization of orality with a relegation of writing. In Zorbas, the papermas overcomes his writer's block and frees himself of his intellectual obsessions, χρησιμοποιώντας τα παντοδύναμα ξόρκα της λέξης. It also takes gramata to immortalize Zorbas. In Greco, Kazantzakis describes as divine the creative power conferred by letters on the writer. He even comes to terms with his own unmanly use of letters as his weapon of choice. Όσο κι αν με καταφρονούν οι πρόγονοι, έχω κι εγώ τα αρματά μου, θα πολεμήσω. So for all his ostensible grammatophobia, Kazantzakis is deep down not a grammatoclast, but a closet grammatoduel. We might speculate at length as to what was behind all that literary grammatophobia and ritualized scribe bashing and I look forward to crowdsourcing some good ideas in the discussion. Was it a preemptive mea culpa to disarm the Philistines, or just an exquisitely ironic trope, using letters to condemn letters, or an intertextual merry-go-round, or all of the above in different measures? My immediate concern is with the Cretan inflection, and I suggest that the Cretan inflection par excellence is the wit and ability to take anathema ta gramata, Christe και όπου τα θέλει, and harnessing the esteem that attaches to oral verbal arts, to spin the anathema into δόξα στα γράμματα, και ζήτωσαν οι γραμματισμένοι. This was not necessarily a Cretan monopoly, but Cretan writers from Kornaros to Kazantzakis have clearly pioneered it and advanced it. Kazantzakis would doubtless respond, δόξα και ανάθεμα είναι ένα, και αυτό το ένα δεν υπάρχει. But life and letters must go on regardless. Why? Even in Cretan Mandinades, the poor old Daskalos gets his moment in the sun. Δεν τον εθέλω εγώ βοσκό και άγριο μαδαρίτη, μα εγώ τον θέλω δάσκαλο να κάθεται στο σπίτι. Δάσκαλο τον εθέλω εγώ, μπουμπούλι και φουντούλι. Musato. The redemption of the teacher is a fitting note on which to end my anaforas ton holton, and to thank my daskalos for gifts that have gone on giving for 44 years.